Bible reading this morning will be coming from Daniel chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Daniel chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. How great are his signs, and how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation.
Good to see you this morning. We are glad that you're here. We've been working our way over the last few weeks, looking at some important things from the book of Daniel in our overall emphasis this year on us doing more in 24. To take some of these lessons that we can learn, some of these characters of the Bible that have left those lessons for us to see, and maybe we could focus on the Lord just a little more clearly. It's an effort. It's a choice. You know, we can make New Year's resolutions and we get busy in life, and before long we facing another year and say, well, I didn't really finish those last year. These are going to be my New Year resolution all over again. We start that process sometimes all over again. I hope we've been really, really intentional this year and just doing more. I'm not assuming that you're not doing anything for the Lord. I know you are. But my challenge has been to us that we just do a little more. And sometimes in life it just requires that, doesn't it? We're busy, we work honestly, we try to take care of our families, but there are circumstances that come up when we have to do a little more in taking care of our families. A little bit more in sacrificing of our own time and energy because it's needed and it's necessary. So we make those kind of choices in life all along the way. My intent has been for us to spend some time in front of the mirror of God's Word daily and just say, how am I doing? Not so we could brag on ourselves or give ourselves a star because we're doing things for the Lord. Just say, am I intentionally improving myself in the Lord's relationship? Am I opening my eyes a little wider to see things that I could do to glorify Him? You see that process taking place in the book of Daniel. You start out with the king, Nebuchadnezzar, who really doesn't know God at all, other than the fact that there is a God over the Jewish people. And in his image, he had conquered those people, and so whoever their God was, he wasn't quite as good as his God is. Now, he's going to have a different perspective before it's all over. And this chapter begins that process for him. Now, he's been exposed to some things already. You remember we looked at him seeing those Jewish young men, Daniel and his comrades, and because they didn't defile their bodies, they ate those things their God would allow them to eat, and they fared better than all the others. Now Nebuchadnezzar didn't know all that. That wasn't revealed to him, but the keeper of the eunuchs allowed that because Daniel requested that. He said, just give us 10 days, and you look at how we fare, and you look at how the others fare, and we'll go from there. And they fared better, and so they were chosen above all the others to serve in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. And they're elevated in his kingdom. But we also know that there have been challenges to that, hasn't it? Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he sought from among his own people interpretations of that dream, his magicians and the wise men of the Chaldeans. And they couldn't give him the dream and certainly couldn't give him the interpretation. So he calls Daniel. And Daniel sends word. I can give the interpretation of that. So he comes in and he tells the king the dream and the interpretation. So that exposes Nebuchadnezzar to God, the God of the Jews, in a different way. But he doesn't just give up his gods. He doesn't think that God is the eternal God and there is no other gods. He just said he is above all other gods. In this particular matter, none of the others could do anything to give them interpretation. But he doesn't abandon his idolatrous position. and nor does he submit himself to the God of Daniel. So when you get to chapter 4, he's telling us what has happened. He's reviewing the history of his experience. That's a little different. Last week we looked at the 3 Hebrew youth were there with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how their faith was demonstrated before the king, and he gave them that second opportunity to bow down to that image, that golden image, and in his mind, here is a representation of God, maybe even a repetition of Nebuchadnezzar as God. But it's his command, when you see this image and you hear the music, you bow down. He's in a position, an exalted position. Well, he gets word that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't bow down. So he gives them another opportunity, and it said he was enraged by that. And they informed him, look, you do what you have to do, and I'm paraphrasing here, obviously. You do what you have to do, king, but we're not bowing down to the image. We're not going to do it. And he said, if you don't bow down, you're going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. And they said, you do what you have to do, but we're not going to bow down. Our God, he said, will your God deliver you? And they said, we don't know. He can. He has the power to. But he may not. But we're not going to bow down anyway. They weren't being arrogant, and they weren't being flippant. They weren't trying to pick a fight. They just knew what their relationship with their God was, and we cannot bow down to any other image. They knew when the commands were given the first time to the Israelite people in Exodus chapter 20, they were specifically told not to make unto them any graven images, and this would have been a graven image, wouldn't it? Nor are you to bow down to them, but you were to serve your God only. So they're just focused on who they're supposed to be. And their faith was tested. But when the king was so angry, he wanted the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than what it would normally be, and he had those young men thrown in there. Now he looks and sees that they're not the only ones in there. Someone else is in there with them, but they're all walking about, and their clothes hadn't been burned. There doesn't seem to be any change in their imagery. And so he asked them to be brought out. And then he declares that their God is the God of gods. But notice he still has that condition, doesn't he? He's just a God among gods, but it's obvious that he's exercised power for his citizens, for his servants, at a different level than what other gods have done to their servants. Now, in the back of Nebuchadnezzar's mind, his God had delivered all these nations into his hand. So he hasn't given up his God. Chapter 4 will tell us that because he hadn't had that right concept, then God's going to humble him. So what we want to learn today, if we can, is how to exalt God a little more. And that is to, in our decisions of life, to make sure God's the one that we make those decisions for. And we don't mind talking to people about it and say, well, that's not something I can participate in because my God has told me to do this or that. That we don't just let him be one of the gods. That we don't have other gods. Now, I doubt anybody in here, if some image was rolled in that was to Buddha or somebody else, we'd say, all right, everybody bow down when you hear the dong on the bell, then everybody bow down. I doubt there's anybody in here that would even have a twinge of saying they're going to bow down in any kind of reverence. Not going to do it. But there can be priorities that I make in my life that I exalt them to a position where they have no business being. That I would give more time, more energy and effort. Not that I would ever deny that the God of heaven is God. But there might be saying, but this is an area where I have a particular desire, or have a particular investment. And so if I have to give this up, or if I have to diminish this in order to serve God in the way he told me to serve him, I'm not sure I'm prepared to work at that level. See, that's where Nebuchadnezzar was. He knew God had to exist. You couldn't exercise these kind of powers if you weren't a God. And he's impressed. He's never really visibly seen his God work that way. Now, he's given his God credit for the success he's had in battle. But he hasn't really seen him work that way. Just to give him a clear interpretation of something that is inescapable. Or to see visibly, okay, I'm going to throw one of my servants into the fire and we're going to ask our God to protect him. Never seen that. So this is pretty impressive. So he starts out, as Tommy read for us in chapter 4, and he emphasizes that he has this exalted image of the God of heaven. Now the reason he's telling us that is because of what happens in the rest of the chapter. He's saying, some things have happened to me. God's got my attention. This God has gotten my attention. But he's speaking at it from a context where that's not the only God that he would see or that he would reverence. And so he's saying he ought to be exalted. In fact, he said to all the people, he hopes in all languages. He's not keeping this a secret. He's sharing this with many people as he could, and he is trying to exalt God because of what he records and is recorded of him in this chapter. You see, you can't exalt God unless you humble yourself. He wasn't there. He acknowledged what he saw, and he acknowledges that again here. And when he says, peace be multiplied in you, he said, I thought it good to show the signs and the wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. I wanted to reveal these things to you. They're kind of inescapable. The power that was demonstrated, I want to tell you about them. I want to exalt the God who performed them. You see, Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 18 said, pride goes before the destruction, and haughty spirit before the fall. Well, this man's about to fall. He's about to take a severe fall. And he said, I thought it good to write this to you, to let you know what that process was like, how that occurred. So we had this image of God, that he had power, and it's going to take that in order for us to exalt God. We have to recognize that when we're talking about exalting, we're talking about raising a person up to a specific elevated position. So he does that here. He does that by acknowledging the power of God. There have been occasions where people had to be shown the power of God multiple times before they ever acknowledged him. You remember the Pharaoh of Egypt, when Moses was told by God, you go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Well, Pharaoh thought they were his people. And he didn't know God. In fact, he says that. When you look at Exodus chapter 3 and you look specifically at that, Exodus chapter 5, and you look specific in context of verse 2, he says to Moses in response to, God said, let my people go. He said, who is the Lord that I should obey him? And then he said, I know not the Lord. I don't know who you're talking about. You're telling me to let my people go to someone that I don't know. You see, he looked at himself as God, like Nebuchadnezzar did. But now Nebuchadnezzar is saying, God is to be exalted because I see his power, and I want to tell you about his power. I saw his signs and his wonders. Now we get to the rest of the chapter, you'll see how he demonstrated those signs and wonders. You'll see specifically that he has this vision that comes to him, and he shares that with his wise men, and they can't answer it. They can't tell him what it means. So he calls Daniel in, and Daniel tells him, here's what it means. In fact, Daniel doesn't want to tell him what it means. Said that Daniel was troubled by it. This is not good news for him. But the king knows enough about God and has been exposed to God enough by God's people, by Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's had enough exposure to know. He said, don't withhold anything to me. You don't have any anxiety over that. Just tell me. And he had this image of this great tree, and here all the birds would rest in its branches, and you'd have the cattle of the field come and get protection under it. And he had this great image of this tree. And all of a sudden it lost its leaves, and the birds couldn't rest in the tree, and the cattle didn't find safety there. It's cut down. What does it mean? Well, Daniel does tell him what that means. And so what's happening here is the king is telling us how he got to this place where he exalted God. I saw his powers and his wonders. But he didn't get there easily. And so that's what we see in those first 3 verses. But then you get to verse 17, you see that if we're going to exalt God, if God's going to be put in an elevated position, then we're going to have to be like Nebuchadnezzar finally came to the conclusion of. And he says, let me find my place here. He said, this matter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and sitteth up over it the basis of men. The answer is, God is in control. I saw his power at work, and I saw it in place. But something else that I saw is that it's God's plan that's going to be carried out. And we're going to see before the chapter's over, he has a really, really short memory of what he saw. He's just rehearsing in this chapter. So when you get to the portion where he says, this is what happened and why, it seems like there's just an immediate loss of memory. But it's a process because he was in a context. That this exposure to God is just an exposure to a God to him, not the God to him. So he hasn't learned yet how to really exalt, raise up, put in the right position the God of heaven. So we can learn a lesson from him. We can place ourselves in context of life. Well, we really have talent and we really have ability, and we have, sometimes we'll say things about someone in our midst who really talented, and they're good at business, and we'll say, it seems like everything they touch turned to gold. Well, there's some people who just have talent, but that gold doesn't control them. They're really good businessmen or businesswomen, and they accomplish great things, and they make money, and they help other people make money, but you never see the money controlling them because they never allow it to be exalted to be their God. We see others. Boy, if it ever gets to the point where the economy looks bad or things start, they get really, really nervous. They look at the future as just being absolutely hopeless. Why? Because that's their God. If I can't stay in this status that I am, and there's not this constant flow of income, and I can't control the things around me, and if people don't see me as someone who has this ability or this status, what would I do? They can't imagine what to do. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was there. He's the king. He's defeated all these other nations. He's got his slaves all around him. So he's exalted in his own mind. Yes, he sees and acknowledges that was an impressive thing. Hey, that's a servant of the Daniel's God, and he brought them out of the fiery furnace. You can't deny that. There they are. The fire's not consuming them. What are you going to do about it? You're going to say, got to acknowledge that God. But doesn't mean I'm going to abandon mine. That's where he is. So when you look at that, you see the context of how exaltation, real exaltation, lifting up, putting in the right position, takes place. You've got to recognize the power of God. Once you grasp that, it's the God who exalts, places in place these rulers, and it's according to his will, his plan. The only reason you're here, Nebuchadnezzar, he's heard that multiple times already, but it hadn't sunk in till now. The only reason you are where you are is because God put you there. Remember the image, the head of fine gold, the breast of silver, and you worked your way down. Didn't sink in real good because he was fixated on him being that head of gold. Boy, I can see this is God knows what's going on because I'm the head of gold. If you paid attention, you're not going to stay the head of gold. There's going to be other people coming to rule, other people come and rule, other people come and rule, and God is saying, I put you there I'm going to take you out, and I'm going to take them out, and I'm going to take them out, and you just pay attention. When it's all said and done, I'm going to set up my kingdom that shall never be destroyed. So exaltation means that we have to see God's power. And we have to then submit to His plan and realize it is God's plan. Paul put it this way in the context of the gospel. He said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to all them that believe, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. His plan is the power. That power that God has, He's put in place in carrying out His plan, and we're not going to be able to do anything about it, other than we can be obedient to it. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1 and 2, it said, God, who at sundry times and divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophet, He hath in these last days spoken unto us through His Son. And then it describes Him giving His Son power to carry these things out. And then it describes His Son's plan to carry that salvation out in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8 and 9. He said, though He were a Son, yet learned He obedience by the things which He suffered. Being made perfect, He became the author of eternal salvation to all them that listen to it, who obey Him. You see, you have to submit to His plan. If you recognize He's got the power, then you have to get to the point where you say, I'll submit to His plan. If you don't, then He's really not exalted. Now, He can be useful. He can exercise His power on your behalf, and you'll take it. But if He's not exalted to the highest position, then you're only going to do the part of His plan that will benefit you in your immediate context of your elevated status of yourself. So I have to do a better job of saying, I'm going to exalt God more in everything that I do. In my own personal relationship, in my prayer life, in my study, I'm going to do that because I want God exalted. The more of God's Word that I know and I understand, the more elevated God can become in my life, and I can follow His plan more clearly. That's my personal responsibility. I have to do that. Say, well, I've studied a long time, and I've been to school, and I know it. What does that mean? If I know it, then I know how important it is to keep learning and to keep studying and keep growing closer to God. I allow that to make me understand that in order for me to treat my wife the way I should, I have to understand how God empowered that relationship so that we together could demonstrate to the world around us what Christ's relationship to His church is. That He could make known the mysteries that people didn't understand in the past. But in order for us to do that, you can't just say, well, we're married. What does that mean? If I treat her differently than God told me to treat her, then I'm only benefited because she's my wife and she does what I tell her to do. Or she provides something for me I want. Rather than say, I have a responsibility here, then my relationship to her to exalt God. So how I treat her is part of that. What about raising my children? Sometimes I can get caught up in what everybody else is doing with their children. I want my children to look like their children, dress like their children, and go where their children go because I don't want to be uncomfortable in the environment in which they are. All of a sudden, God doesn't get exalted. I can't get to the point where I can say, no, you really can't go there. Because, see, that wouldn't promote God. It wouldn't draw you closer to God. It would diminish those things that we've studied together that God expects us to be and God expects us to do. Sometimes we can get timid. Well, they're only going to be young once. You're absolutely right. And they need to remember their Creator in the days of their youth, while the evil days come not and the years draw nigh when they shall say, I have no pleasure in Him. Folks, we got a lot of folks. A lot of young people. A lot of old people. Virtually saying, I have no pleasure in them. It's not a pleasurable thing, not an enjoyable thing to serve God. Because they haven't exalted Him to say, He is the Creator. He does have the power. He's demonstrated it. And He's provided that salvation through His Son. and that his word is powerful. It's sharp, sharper than any two-edged sword, and that it pierces, even dividing asunder the soul and spirit and joint and marrow, and is discerned of both the thoughts and intents of the heart. We'll talk about some of these lessons tonight, but I wanted to get that concept of exaltation, of lifting up, putting in the right position the God of heaven, so that you and I then could determine that everything we do is going to be to exalt Him. And when people see our relationship with Him, how we conduct our lives, they will immediately connect us to Him. So when Nebuchadnezzar was told that the meaning of the dream was that he was going to be humbled, and he was going to be driven out of his kingdom, and he was going to take on the mind of an animal, and for 7 years he's going to graze like an ox would graze in the field. That's pretty stark, isn't it? When you have an exalted God, you know He's got some power, and you know He's demonstrated many wondrous things. And He'd said in the early verses, I want to show you the wonders and signs of God. Now He's speaking based on Him having spent 7 years in the field, grazing like an ox. You've got to know how I got there, because I didn't submit to God. So when you get to verse 28, and this came unto the king Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of the 12 months, he walked in his palace of the kingdom of Babylon, and the king spake and said, Listen, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? Who do you hear? Who do you see? Nebuchadnezzar. He's looking at all of his kingdom. Look at all this. Wow, maybe like a businessman, and look at all these buildings that represent all my company, all the different ventures that I now have. Look at all these workers. Maybe take somebody through all those businesses and just see all the people at the machine doing all the work, and yep, I did this. I built it from scratch. Nebuchadnezzar doing that with his kingdom, though he's already been told multiple times, God put you there. You see that head of fine gold? That's you. God put you there. He heard that audibly. He understood. But he saw it as a position of honor. God recognizes what I recognize. I'm number one. And so he's looking at this kingdom, and listen to this, though. While the words was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. And they shall drive thee from men, and thou shalt dwell as beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou knowest that the Most High rules in the kingdom of man, and giveth it to whomsoever he wills. Sounds a little repetitious, doesn't it? You better know who rules. Now, he said it verbally multiple times. He rules. When you get to the last part of that chapter, the third point we want to make, not only do you see his power, see God's power, but you also have to submit to his plan, and then you have to show him praise. You have to acknowledge that. You say, well, I'll never speak against him, and most of us would fit into that category, say, I would never say anything that would purposely be blasphemous, that I'd speak against God. That ought to indicate that I didn't believe he existed, or that he's pure and holy, and that he is the judge. I would acknowledge his power. But do I live in such a way? Do I speak in such a way? Do I dress in such a way that he would be praised? Or would all those categories be just kind of blended in and be no different than what you see in the world? If that's true, then I'm praising myself. Hey, you see that symbol on my shirt? That's the latest style, you know. That's what everybody's buying these days. There's not anything wrong with buying clothes or feeling good in a particular kind of clothes, but all of a sudden, if that gets exalted, I feel less than I normally would. I wouldn't want to be around you if I just bought those clothes somewhere where it was just the cheapest because I'm frugal. I wouldn't feel comfortable with that. You see, that creates an atmosphere. That's where Nebuchadnezzar was. I wanted everybody to know who I am. Look at all the kingdoms that I have built. Now, he's had multiple opportunities to change, verbalize some of that understanding of God, but never exalted God. When you get to the last verses, here's what it says. Beginning in verse 34. At the end of the days, Nebuchadnezzar I lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and my understanding, listen, my understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, whose kingdom is from generation to generation. You're the head of fine gold, but there are people coming after you. Not so with God. When you get that exalted image of God and saying, He is the God of heaven, now I understand, now my mind is open, now I'm going to make sure that I praise His name because He is everlasting. I know I'm not. He is. And I know my kingdom's going to end, Nebuchadnezzar is saying, but His is not. He's finally there, and he's wanting them to hear what He's saying. I understand who God is now. It took 7 years of grazing grass for him to get to that point. I would hope that we wouldn't have to go through those kind of things to really put ourselves in submission to God. At the same time, he said in verse 26, reason returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom, mine honor and brightness returned unto me, and my counselors and my Lord sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and an excellent majesty was added unto me. I wonder who added it. I wonder who he thinks added it. He knows who added it. It's God who's added it, because here's what he said. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways are judgment. And those that walk in pride, he is able to abase. He's saying, I can testify that those who walk in pride, he can abase. From one moment saying, look at my kingdom and all the things I've done, to the voice saying, and it's over for you. You're going 7 years, you're going to be like an oxen. When he came to himself with all those claws that had grown out, all the years he'd spent in this exile, his eyes are open and God's exalted. We don't have to go through that because these things are written aforetime. We're written for our learning, that we through patience, comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. But since we have referred to Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8 and 9, speaking of Jesus, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. Being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation to all them. Here's the exception. Here's the consciousness. Here's the exaltation. All them that obey him get to choose. Will you put God first in your life? If you do, you can become a child of God. You can acknowledge your faith in him, turn away from your sins in repentance. Your lips acknowledge that he is the very Son of God. And your will submit to his requirements of baptism to have your past sins washed away and for your new life to begin. Those of us who've done that, sometimes we begin to organize our lives and control our lives and make our decision, with God being a part of it, but not being exalted to his position. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33 says, seek ye first the kingdom of God, his righteousness. Then all these things shall be added unto you. Didn't say you can't have these things. He said, you put him first. Are you doing that this morning? Can we help you do that while we stand and while we sing?